Stop right now, and do not scroll past this moment, because what you are about to witness is not just a letter. It is a hidden emotional confession that was never meant to be seen, never meant to be spoken about, and never meant to reach the people it was addressed to. And if you stay until the end, you will understand why one sealed envelope changed everything between Jin Ze, Zhang Linghe, and Tian Xiwei in ways no one could have ever predicted. It began on an ordinary night that did not feel important at the time. No cameras were present. No interviews were scheduled. No public appearances marked the moment. Only silence existed in the space where everything would later unfold. Jin Ze was alone in a room that felt quieter than usual, not because it was empty, but because it carried the weight of thoughts that refused to settle. He had been staring at a blank sheet of paper for a long time. Not because he did not know what to write, but because he knew exactly what writing it would mean. Some words do not just express emotion, they expose truth. And truth, once released, cannot be contained again. Outside, life continued normally. Lights in distant buildings flickered like nothing significant was happening. But inside that still moment, something irreversible was forming. A letter, not for public eyes. Not for fans, not for the world that usually interpreted everything, but for two people who had unknowingly shaped parts of his emotional journey. Zhang Linghe and Tian Xiwei. Jin Ze did not rush the process. Each word he wrote carried hesitation before commitment, because he was not writing to impress. He was writing to release, and release always comes with uncertainty. He began with something simple, not dramatic, not poetic, just honest reflection about time, distance, and everything that had remained unspoken between them. As the pen moved across the page, memories surfaced without permission. Moments that were never addressed properly. Conversations that ended too quickly. Situations where silence replaced clarity. And misunderstandings that grew quietly because no one corrected them in time. He paused more than once, not because he wanted to stop, but because he understood there was no returning to ignorance once the truth was fully expressed. When he finally finished writing, the paper did not feel like paper anymore. It felt heavier, as if emotion itself had weight. He folded it carefully, slowly, deliberately, like someone sealing something fragile that could break the moment it was exposed to air. He placed it inside an envelope, wrote their names on it, Zhang Linghe, Tian Xiwei. And for a long time he just looked at it, because once delivered, there would be no control over what it became. The next morning, the letter was left behind in a place no one expected. Not directly handed, not publicly revealed, but quietly placed where it would eventually be discovered by someone it was never meant for in that exact way. That was the beginning of everything shifting. Zhang Linghe was the first to see it. At first, he did not open it immediately. Something about it felt different. Not suspicious, not alarming, but emotionally heavy in a way that could not be ignored. When he finally opened it, the atmosphere around him changed. Not physically, but internally, because the words inside were not written casually. They were written with restraint breaking slowly, over time. He read in silence. Once, then again. Each sentence revealing layers he had never been shown before. Not accusations, not blame, but perspective. And perspective can sometimes be more powerful than confrontation. Tian Xiwei saw it later, and her reaction was not immediate either. She sat down before reading it fully, as if instinctively understanding that standing while absorbing something so emotionally dense would not feel stable. When she began reading, her expression softened in ways that were not easy to explain, because the letter was not about dividing people. It was about revealing how deeply unspoken emotions can exist between individuals who never fully expressed what they felt at the right time. Jin Ze did not write to hurt anyone. He wrote to finally say what had been left unsaid for too long. And that is what made it powerful, because honesty that arrives late still carries impact. Even if it cannot change the past. The tension that followed was not loud. There were no arguments, no dramatic reactions, no public escalation. Instead, there was silence. the kind of silence that forces reflection. Zhang Linghe and Tian Xiwei did not immediately speak about it to others. They processed it differently, separately, quietly, because some emotional truths are not meant for immediate reaction. They are meant for understanding over time. Jin Ze, meanwhile, did not attempt to follow up. He did not send explanations. He did not try to clarify interpretations, because the letter was never meant to control the outcome. It was meant to exist as truth without interruption. Days passed, then more, and something subtle began to change. Not relationships breaking, not connections forming instantly, but perception adjusting. Because once you see someone's unfiltered emotional honesty, you cannot return to the version of understanding you had before. One evening, Zhang Linghe finally spoke about it briefly. Not publicly detailed, not overly emotional, just a simple acknowledgement that some things carry meaning beyond intention. Tian Xiwei also reflected in her own way, understanding that not every emotional expression is meant to create resolution. Some are meant to close internal chapters that were never properly finished. And Jin Ze remained quiet through all of it, not because he was detached, but because he had already said everything he needed to say in the only form that felt complete. The story did not end with confrontation. It did not end with reconciliation. It ended with awareness. The awareness that emotions, once unspoken for too long, eventually find a way to surface in unexpected forms. And when they do not ask for permission. They simply exist and change everything around them. The final question this letter leaves behind is not about who is right or wrong. It is about what happens when truth arrives after silence has already shaped perception. Do you accept it as closure? Or do you see it as the beginning of understanding something that was never fully seen before? The silence that followed was different. Not empty, not calm, but heavy in a way that made even ordinary moments feel slower. Jin Ze did not ask what they thought of the letter. He did not send follow-up messages. He did not try to explain anything further, because what had been written was never meant to be edited by reaction. It was meant to exist as it was, unfiltered, uninterrupted, unavoidable. Zhang Linghe after reading. Zhang Linghe stayed quiet longer than expected, not because he was confused, but because clarity had arrived in a form that felt emotionally sharper than imagination. He replayed sections of the letter in his mind. Not the entire thing, but fragments. Phrases that carried weight beyond their simplicity. What stayed with him most was not accusation. It was perspective. A perspective that revealed how much of reality can exist without ever being spoken aloud. He finally stood up and walked out of the room. Not in anger, not in distress, but in reflection. Because some truths require movement before understanding settles. Outside, the air felt different. Not because the world changed, but because his interpretation of it had. Tian Xiwei's quiet realization. Tian Xiwei read the letter again later that night. This time slower, not searching for meaning, but allowing meaning to surface naturally. She noticed something she did not feel the first time: the absence of blame. There was no attempt in the letter to divide or accuse. Instead, there was emotional exhaustion, and honesty shaped by time. She placed the letter on the table and leaned back slightly. Not overwhelmed, but thoughtful. Because she understood something important. Not every emotional expression is meant to create resolution. Some exist simply to explain what was never understood in the moment it mattered. The shift between them. The following days did not bring confrontation. They brought distance in a different form. Not separation, but observation. Zhang Linghe and Tian Xiwei did not immediately speak about the letter together. They processed it separately, because emotional understanding does not always move at the same pace for everyone involved. And forcing alignment would have only created distortion. Instead, silence became the shared language again. But this time it was not ignorance. It was processing. Jin Ze remained still. Jin Ze did not monitor reactions. He did not check responses repeatedly. He did not search for validation in silence, because he already understood something before writing the letter. Once truth is released, ownership ends. What remains is interpretation. And interpretation belongs to others. He continued his routine as if nothing had changed externally. But internally, something had already completed itself. A cycle that had remained open for too long was finally no longer unfinished. A meeting that did not seek resolution. Several days later, the three of them found themselves in the same space. Not planned as confrontation. Not designed for closure. Just coincidence, shaped by timing. When they saw each other, there was no shock. Only awareness. Zhang Linghe nodded slightly. Tian Xiwei acknowledged quietly. Jin Ze responded in the same calm manner. No one rushed to speak first, because none of them needed urgency anymore. Eventually Zhang Linghe broke the silence. You did not write it to change anything. Jin Ze looked at him briefly.
No.
Tian Xiwei added softly. Then why write it? Jin Ze paused. Not because he did not know, but because the answer required honesty without decoration. Because silence had already changed everything before I spoke. That sentence settled in the space between them, not as argument, but as realization. Understanding without repair.
There was no attempt to fix the past.
No desire to reverse anything. Instead, something more subtle formed. Understanding without restoration. Because not all truths are meant to rebuild what was lost. Some are meant to finally explain why it could not remain unchanged. Zhang Linghe spoke again. It makes more sense now than it did then. Tian Xiwei nodded slightly. Maybe it was never about making sense immediately. Jin Ze did not add anything. Because sometimes agreement does not need reinforcement. Only recognition. The final moment. Before leaving, there was a final pause. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just stillness. Zhang Linghe spoke once more. Things feel different now. Jin Ze responded calmly. They are. Tian Xiwei looked between them briefly. But not worse. That line stayed in the air longer than the others. Because it defined the entire shift. Not loss. Not gain. But change without collapse. Ending. What remains after the letter. When they eventually parted ways, there was no conclusion ceremony. No emotional closure scene. No final dramatic exchange. Just separation that felt lighter than expectation. Because clarity had already replaced confusion. And understanding had replaced speculation. Jin Ze walked away knowing he had said everything necessary. Zhang Linghe walked away carrying perspective he did not have before. Tian Xiwei walked away with reflection that would continue shaping her interpretation of events. And none of them remained the same version of themselves that existed before the letter. Final closing narration. And so the letter that was never meant to be read did not destroy anything. It did not repair anything either. Instead, it revealed something far more permanent. That unspoken emotions do not disappear with time. They only wait for the moment they can no longer remain silent. And when they finally surface, they do not ask permission to change perception. They simply do. Quietly. Completely. Irreversibly.